She was the woman who poured water, a trembling, invisible server who nobody ever noticed. That was their mistake. The moment Don Salvatore Moretti, the undisputed king of Sicily, entered Il Giglio, all the air vanished from the grand dining room. Men who were killers by trade found themselves drenched in sweat inside their expensive suits. But when the quiet waitress came to his table, she did not spill a single drop or let her voice crack. She met the eyes of the most feared man alive and uttered 5 simple words. They were spoken in a dialect that had not been heard outside the hills of Corleone since 1990. The entire restaurant did not just fall quiet, it became frozen in time. That was because her words were not a welcome. They were the pronouncement of a death sentence. And in that entire room, only 3 people understood the gravity of what had just happened. This is the story of Sofia, the waitress who concealed an entire kingdom under her simple uniform. This story will prove that in a world full of wolves, the most dangerous creature isn't the one with the sharpest teeth. It's the one who knows exactly when to strike. It will show you that being invisible is not weakness, it's power. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the one who changes everything. If you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or dismissed as nobody, this story is for you. Stay until the end. The dinner service at Il Giglio was never calm. It was a tightly controlled exercise in collective panic. Located deep in Manhattan's financial district, the restaurant stood as a monument to marble, rich mahogany, and generational wealth. This was the sort of establishment where a single bottle of wine cost significantly more than Sophia's monthly rent. The patrons whispered about corporate takeovers, hostile acquisitions, and other business that would put any normal person behind the bars of a federal penitentiary. Sophia Rossi pulled the strings of her apron so tight they bit into her flesh. She glanced at her own image in the gleaming brass surface of the espresso machine. She saw the dark smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes, her hair pulled back into a chaotic bun, and a uniform that was deliberately one size too large. She was the picture of someone who was utterly forgettable, which was exactly her goal. Rossi. Table 4 is thirsty. Get moving. The floor manager, a perpetually perspiring man named Mr. Henderson, who carried the scent of old coffee and quiet desperation, snapped his fingers right in front of her face. "Of course, sir." Immediately, Sophia murmured, her gaze fixed firmly on her worn-out shoes. She drifted through the crowded dining room like a phantom, a ghost among the living. That was her greatest skill. She had discovered long ago that the key to survival was to remain completely unseen. If you were invisible, no one could harm you. If you were silent, no one could make you a target. For 3 long years, she had been a specter in New York City. She paid for her small sublet in Queens with cash. She worked under the table whenever possible. And she never, ever held anyone's gaze for more than a single, fleeting second. But the atmosphere inside Il Giglio tonight felt different, heavier. It was not the standard pressure of a busy Friday evening. This felt charged, almost electric. The kitchen crew had been walking on eggshells since 4 p.m. The head chef, a volatile Frenchman who typically treated plates as projectiles for sport, was now quietly and intensely wiping down his own stainless steel counters. "A big reservation is coming," whispered Marco, a young busboy, as he stacked a heavy tray next to Sophia. The owner himself called. He said to clear out the entire VIP mezzanine for them. A cold sense of dread began to crawl up the back of Sophia's neck. Who is it this time, a senator? Marco just shook his head, his eyes growing wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Much bigger. It is the Morettis. The wineglass in Sophia's hand jolted just a fraction of an inch before her fingers clamped down on it, a single splash of ice water chilling her wrist. Moretti. That name was a curse in some parts of the city. To the public, they were legitimate businessmen, involved in waste management or international shipping. But in the shadowed alleys where Sophia desperately tried to avoid, the Moretti family was the only law that mattered. Dante Moretti represented the modern face of the operation, a man who was as handsome as he was ruthless and corporate. but clearing the entire mezzanine suggested the old guard had come to town. "I have to take my break," Sophia said, her voice shaking almost imperceptibly. "No more breaks," Henderson snapped from across the kitchen pass. "They have arrived. Everyone line up by the staircase now." Sophia's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, like a caged bird desperate for escape. She was trapped. Running now would only draw the very attention she avoided. Being noticed tonight meant death. She found her place at the far end of the service line, her head bowed low, sending a silent prayer to a god she had long abandoned, begging to stay invisible. The large front doors swung inward, and the ambient temperature of the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. The security team entered first, 4 imposing men who looked as if they were chiseled from solid granite, their dead eyes sweeping the room for any potential threat. Following them was Dante Moretti. Sophia dared to peek through her lowered eyelashes. He was devastatingly handsome and utterly terrifying, dressed in a charcoal suit that molded to his frame like a second skin. He moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a jungle cat, his dark hair slicked back from his face, his jaw clenched with grim focus. He had the look of a man who was tired of violence but remained exceptionally skilled at it. Yet the room did not hold its breath for Dante. It held its breath for the man who followed him. Don Salvatore Moretti, the capo di capi of the old world. He appeared to be in his late 60s, depending heavily on a polished ebony cane that was capped with a snarling silver lion's head. He was dressed in a fedora and a long, heavy wool coat, looking like an apparition from a long-forgotten era. His face was a roadmap of old scars and deep wrinkles, and his eyes were obscured behind dark, tinted glasses. A profound hush fell over the restaurant. Forks paused halfway to mouths. All conversations ceased. Mr. Henderson was physically trembling with anxiety. "Welcome, Don Moretti. Mr. Moretti, this is a true honor." Dante simply raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "The table. Now." "Of course, sir. This way." As the powerful procession glided past the line of employees, Sophia held her breath, chanting in her mind, "Do not, do. Look up. Do not look up. Do not look up." Then, Don Salvatore came to a complete stop. He stood directly in front of her. The rich aroma of expensive cigar smoke and aged leather enveloped her. Sophia kept her eyes locked on the mirror-like shine of his Italian shoes. "This one," Salvatore said, his voice a low rumble like shifting gravel. "She is trembling." Dante let out an exhausted sigh. "Papa, let us please sit. The girl is simply nervous." "Fear is a useful thing," Salvatore murmured softly. He then tapped the toe of Sophia's shoe with the tip of his cane. "Look at me, little one." Sophia forced her eyes shut for a brief second, gathering every shred of the character she had so carefully built, the timid, terrified nobody. She lifted her head, making her eyes go wide and allowing her bottom lip to quiver just so. "I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, raising the pitch of her voice to sound younger, more innocent. I have never seen a real famous person up close before." Salvatore studied her, his dark, calculating eyes piercing through her defense. For one terrifying moment, Sophia was certain he saw past the cheap uniform, beyond the manufactured fear. She thought he could see right down to the very blood that coursed through her veins. And then he chuckled. It was a dry, wheezing sound. "Famous. Yes. Bring us the wine, little mouse. And try not to drop it." They continued. Sophia finally allowed herself to breathe, and she was shocked to feel her knees physically shaking. She had survived their entrance, but she knew the ordeal of the night was only just beginning. Dante Moretti unfastened the button on his suit jacket as he took his seat, his eyes methodically scanning the mezzanine level. It was a secure location. He had his own men positioned at the stairwell and at the kitchen service entrance. Despite the precautions, he could not relax. His father's presence in New York, was a constant logistical headache. Salvatore refused to understand that the rules of the world had changed. He had no concern for RICO statutes or hidden surveillance cameras. He demanded respect. He demanded fine wine. And he demanded to criticize Dante's management of the American operations. "This architecture has no soul," Salvatore complained, making a vague gesture toward the high, vaulted ceilings. "It feels like a bank." "You conduct business in a bank, Dante?" "It is modern, Papa. This is what people with money appreciate," Dante countered, motioning for the sommelier. He did not actually want the sommelier. He wanted a double shot of scotch. But tonight was about upholding tradition. "People appreciate what we instruct them to appreciate," Salvatore corrected him. He glanced around the large table. His old consigliere, Rocco, and two of his personal Sicilian bodyguards sat stone-faced and silent. "Where is that little mouse? I require wine." Dante signaled to Henderson, who nearly shoved the frightened waitress toward the staircase. Dante observed her as she made her way to their table. She was slight of build, with a pale complexion and wide, frantic brown eyes. She was clutching the expensive bottle of Barolo as if it were an explosive device. "She is going to pass out," Dante thought to himself. "Wonderful. Just another problem for me to handle." "Open it," Salvatore ordered. As Sophia arrived at the table, her hands were visibly shaking, but as Dante continued to watch, he observed something strange. The very instant the corkscrew made contact with the bottle, her trembling ceased completely. Her motions became economical, precise, and graceful. She applied the leverage perfectly. The cork came out with barely a whisper. It was the pour of a seasoned professional. She served the wine without letting a single drop escape. "That is interesting," Dante mused. "Nerves of solid steel once the work begins." She gently placed the wineglass in front of Salvatore. The old Don swirled the dark red liquid, inhaled its aroma, and then glanced up at her, a playful, cruel glint appearing in his eyes. He was playing a game with her. He always tested the staff. It was a small act of power he savored, making ordinary people squirm under his gaze. "Are you Italian?" Salvatore asked her, speaking in English. "Yes, sir." "My grandmother was," she whispered. "Where was she from?" "Naples, sir." Salvatore let out a scoff, waving his hand dismissively. Naples, a city of loudmouths, pickpockets, and street singers. Dante noticed the waitress's jaw muscle clench. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something other than fear. It looked more like insulted pride. Salvatore leaned in closer, changing his language to standard Italian. "Do you comprehend this language? Or are you simply another American girl with a pretty name that ends in a vowel?" Sophia lowered her head respectfully. "I understand a small amount, signore," she answered in surprisingly decent, though broken, Italian. Salvatore smirked at her response. He then turned his attention to Rocco, switching languages once more. This time, however, he spoke neither English nor standard Italian. He slid into the coarse, guttural dialect of the Sicilian heartland, using a hyper-localized slang from the mountains surrounding Corleone. It was the language of shepherds and bandits, a tongue so obscure it was unintelligible even to most other Italians. "Look at this one, Rocco," Salvatore said in the dialect, a cruel grin spreading across his face. A pretty face, but her eyes are completely vacant. She is like a sheep waiting patiently for the butcher. We could bring her back to the villa with us. She would be good for warming a bed before we get rid of her. It was an incredibly crude and brutal test of his surroundings. Salvatore would often say shocking things in this dialect, just to see if anyone in the room would react. If they did, he knew they were listening. If they did not, they were harmless. Dante's body went rigid with frustration. He despised it when his father spoke in that degrading manner. "Papa, that is enough," he warned him in English. But then, the unthinkable occurred. Sophia had been backing away from the table, the silver tray held tightly against her chest. Her training, her every survival instinct, told her to just walk away. She was supposed to continue being the invisible girl. But his insult, that specific vulgar phrase about being a sheep for the butcher, it ignited something buried deep within her, something that completely overrode her need for survival. She stopped moving. She slowly turned back to face the table. The silence that fell over the men was absolute. Dante stared at her, completely bewildered. Was she about to start crying? Instead, Sophia looked directly at Salvatore. The terror vanished completely from her features. Her entire body language transformed, her spine straightening and her chin rising with an unnerving regal authority. In that one terrifying second, she was no longer a servant. She was royalty. When she spoke, her voice was not the waitress's timid whisper. It was a deep, resonant, and perfectly measured cadence, a sound of ancient power. The sheep that finds safety is the one who observes the wolf while it sleeps. Don Salvatore, a guest who dares to insult the bread of his host, will find only ashes for breakfast. She spoke in his mother tongue. Not merely Sicilian, but his specific ancestral dialect. The archaic, almost forgotten phrasing unique to the Moretti family's private stronghold. It was a collection of words and phrases that had not been spoken commonly since the 1970s, a ghost language from another time. The sound that followed was a gunshot in the silent room. Rocco's fork had clattered against his expensive china plate. At the far end of the long table, the two bodyguards immediately slipped their hands inside their jackets, their gazes fixed on Sophia like twin laser sights. Dante, however, remained perfectly still. He found he could not move. He was staring at his father, captivated. For the very first time in his entire life, Dante saw Don Salvatore Moretti look utterly and profoundly shocked. The old man's jaw was slack, his mouth hanging slightly open. All color had fled his face. He looked at Sophia, but he was not seeing a waitress. He was seeing an apparition from his past. "Who are you?" Salvatore whispered, and his voice, the voice that commanded armies of men, trembled with disbelief. The moment shattered. The illusion broke. Sophia's eyes went wide, the full weight of her catastrophic mistake crashing down upon her. The mask had not just slipped, it had been torn away. She had just revealed her true self to the most ruthless and powerful family on the continent. I need to go get the antipasto," she stammered, the words feeling like sand in her mouth. She pivoted and fled. It was not a brisk walk. She sprinted with desperate speed toward the swinging kitchen doors. "Get her!" Salvatore roared, his voice shaking the room. He smashed his heavy cane down on the table, and a crystal wine glass exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. "Bring that woman to me now." Dante was already rising from his chair. "You stay here," he commanded his men, his mind churning at 1,000 miles an hour. He leaped effortlessly over the low brass railing of the private mezzanine, landing silently, and took off in pursuit of the waitress. He slammed through the kitchen doors just a second too late, catching a glimpse of the restaurant's back door swinging closed. "Move!" Dante yelled, physically shoving a stunned sous chef out of his path. He kicked the heavy metal door open with explosive force and burst out into the slick, rain-drenched alleyway. He scanned left, then right, his eyes piercing the gloom. At the far end of the alley, under a sickly yellow light, he saw her. She was moving with incredible speed. She was scaling a tall chain-link fence with an athletic grace that no simple waitress should ever possess. "Stop!" Dante shouted, his hand reflexively moving to the cold steel of the gun holstered at the small of his back. She reached the top of the fence and paused for a single, breathtaking moment to look back at him. Beneath the harsh, buzzing street lamp, their eyes locked across the distance. Dante had expected to see raw fear. He saw something else entirely. He saw cold, hard calculation. She was not fleeing like a terrified victim. She was executing a tactical retreat, like a trained soldier breaking contact with the enemy. "You have no idea what you have just done," Dante called out, taking a deliberate step forward into the rain. "I know precisely who you are, Dante Moretti," she yelled back, her voice ringing out, clear and defiant. "And I know that if your father discovers who I truly am, he will not just kill me, he will burn this entire city to the ground to make sure I am gone." She swung her body over the fence, dropped to the pavement on the other side, and was swallowed by the night. Dante stood alone in the downpour, his heart pounding with an adrenaline he had not felt in years. He pressed the button on his earpiece. "Boss!" The voice of his head of security crackled with urgency. "Do you want us to lock down the entire restaurant?" "Forget the restaurant," Dante snarled, his eyes still fixed on the empty fence where she had been. "Find that girl. I want to know everything. And under no circumstances do you let my father get to her first." Sophia did not stop running until her lungs felt like they had been scoured with fire. She moved in a dizzying pattern through the maze of Tribeca's streets, doubling back through dark alleys, cutting down into a subway station only to emerge from a different exit without ever boarding a train, finally coming up for air 6 blocks away. She slipped into the humid anonymity of a 24-hour laundromat, collapsing into a hard plastic chair in the darkest corner, concealed by a rumbling line of industrial dryers. She buried her face against her knees, trying desperately to control the violent shaking in her hands. Stupid, stupid, utterly stupid. She had maintained this cover for 3 long years. 3 years of coloring her hair this forgettable shade of brown, of wearing shapeless clothes to hide the curves of her body, of ruthlessly suppressing the fiery spirit that was her birthright. And tonight, she had thrown it all away, shattered her entire world because of a casual insult from a foolish man. But it was more than just an insult. It was that specific dialect. Hearing those old words had awakened something deep inside her, a muscle memory that bypassed all her training and triggered a primal response from a childhood she had fought so hard to bury. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a burner, a cheap, untraceable flip phone she reserved for the gravest of emergencies. Only a single person in the entire world had this number. She flipped it open with a trembling thumb. It was a single text message. "They are looking. Leave the apartment now." Sophia stared at the glowing words on the tiny screen. With a surge of cold resolve, she crushed the fragile phone in her fist, snapped the tiny SIM card in two, and discarded the pieces into a nearby trash can filled with discarded dryer sheets. She could never return to her apartment in Queens. It was no longer safe. Her emergency stash of cash was hidden beneath the floorboards there, along with the forged passport that identified her as Maria Fiore. That identity was gone forever. She was Sophia Rossi once again, or, more accurately, she was finally forced to be who she was always born to be. She quickly checked her pockets. $50 in tips, the key to her now useless locker, and a small pocket knife she never left home without. "Okay," she whispered to the humming machines around her. "Think. What would Papa do?" The memory of her father brought a sharp, stabbing pain. Do not think about the blood. Remember the lesson. Lesson number 4. When the wolf has your scent, you do not run for the den. You run for the water. She forced herself to stand, wiped the tear tracks from her face, and walked with renewed purpose out of the laundromat. She had a new destination. She needed to reach the docks in Red Hook. An old associate of her father's was there, a man who owed her family a sacred debt that even death could not erase. Meanwhile, back at Il Giulio, the atmosphere was as grim and silent as a tomb. The entire restaurant had been emptied of patrons. The terrified staff were now being detained in the kitchen, their cell phones confiscated and placed in a pile on a steel counter. Dante paced relentlessly in the private dining room, his eyes constantly returning to his father. Don Salvatore sat motionless in a high-backed chair, his gaze fixed on a blank, empty wall. In the span of an hour, he seemed to have aged a full decade. He was drinking grappa, and the hand that held the glass had a slight but noticeable tremor. "Father," Dante began, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "My men are wiping every camera feed clean. But it is useless. We pulled her employment records. The social security number is fake, and the address does not exist. This woman is a complete phantom. Salvatore continued to stare into the fireplace, his face unmoving. She used the old words, Dante, the language of the inner circle. It was more than just the dialect, it was the specific code. I know, Dante confirmed, the ice clinking in the glass he poured. She made a direct threat against you. She said you would eat ash. That was not a threat, Salvatore corrected, his voice cutting through the air with sudden force. It was a proverb. It speaks of a guest who dares to insult the bread of his host. It is the phrase the wives of the capos would use to put arrogant young men back in their place. It is a statement of power, a tool of correction. Salvatore finally turned to face his son, and his eyes were filled with ghosts. Only a single family ever used that exact phrase. The Valentis. The name hung in the air, cold and heavy. Dante stopped moving entirely. The whiskey glass paused an inch from his mouth. But the Valentis are gone, he said, the words catching in his throat. You destroyed them. Every last one. That was the night of the long knives, back in 1998. You erased their entire bloodline from the earth. I believed I had, Salvatore confessed, his voice dropping to a fragile whisper. But Giovanni Valente had a little girl. Her name was Sofia. She was only 12 years old on the night we set fire to their house. We discovered a child's remains in the ashes. The dental records were a perfect match. We were so certain. Dental records can be falsified if you have enough influence and enough money, Dante said, his mind racing to connect the impossible dots. The Valentis were the only family in history who had ever come close to challenging the Morettis for the throne of Sicily. They were an ancient line, known for their ruthlessness, but also for a code of honor that the modern Mafia had long since abandoned. If that girl is truly Sofia Valente, Salvatore said, his voice losing its tremor and hardening into cold steel, then she is the rightful inheritor of a blood feud that demands my head on a silver platter. And she has been standing right beside me, serving me water for how long? 6 months, Dante answered. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He had walked past her nearly every single day. He had barely even noticed her. And in all that time, she could have put poison in his food, a knife in his back, or burned this entire building down around them. Why didn't she? Find her, Dante, Salvatore commanded, pushing himself to his feet and leaning heavily on his cane. All traces of frailty were gone. The wounded lion was back. Find her before the Russos or any of our rivals learn that she exists. If our enemies discover that a Valente is still alive, they will flock to her banner. It will ignite a civil war. I will bring her to you, Dante promised. Alive, Salvatore added, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I want to look directly into her eyes when I finish the work I started 20 years ago. Dante gave a single sharp nod and turned to leave, but as he stepped out into the cool, rain-washed night air, a decision formed in his mind. He would find Sofia Valente, of that there was no doubt. But he was no longer certain that he would be delivering her to his father. Because for the first time in a very long time, Dante Moretti was completely and utterly intrigued. And for a man who already had everything, a genuine mystery was the only prize worth chasing. The rain in New York City does not wash anything clean. It only serves to make the existing grime slicker and more treacherous. By the time Sophia finally reached Red Hook, the relentless storm had transformed the cityscape into a smeared, abstract painting of neon reflections and deep gray shadows. The docks were a veritable graveyard of rusting shipping containers and colossal cranes that loomed against the dark sky like the skeletons of long-dead prehistoric monsters. She limped painfully toward a decrepit bait and tackle shop perched at the very edge of Pier 41. To any casual observer, it looked completely abandoned. The windows were boarded over with weathered plywood that had begun to rot away from the nails. But Sophia knew the truth. She knew that 3 feet below the waterline, attached to the pier's pilings, was a sophisticated pressure sensor. If you failed to knock on the front door with the precise required rhythm, 2 quick taps, a pause, 1 slow tap, a pause, then 3 more quick taps, a shotgun rigged behind the frame would instantly turn your chest into a bloody ruin. She raised her fist and knocked. Ratat. Thud. Ratatat. A long, heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of the rain. Then came the metallic screech of a rusty deadbolt being laboriously withdrawn. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing a sliver of profound darkness and the menacing barrel of a Remington 870 shotgun. "We are closed," a voice growled from within. It sounded like heavy chains being dragged across a concrete floor. "The tide is high, Enzo," Sophia said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the violent shivering that racked her body. "But the fish are not biting." The shotgun barrel was lowered in an instant. The door swung fully open. Enzo, the man they called the butcher, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was 70 years old, dressed in a grease-stained tank top that showed off arms completely covered in the faded blue ink of old prison tattoos. He had been her father's most trusted and loyal lieutenant, the very man who had smuggled her out of Sicily, wrapped tightly in an old rug and hidden on a fishing trawler the night her entire family was murdered. "Sophia," he breathed, his eyes going wide in the dim light. With a frantic gesture, he yanked her into the bait shop and threw the door shut behind her. The sound of 3 separate deadbolts slamming home echoed in the small space. "Madone, I thought you were safe over in Queens. I believed you were protected." "I was," Sophia answered, her body giving out. She leaned heavily against a tall stack of lobster traps, her legs failing as she slid all the way to the dusty floor. "At least, I was until tonight. I saw him, Enzo. I actually saw Salvatore." Enzo's face lost all its color, turning a sickly pale. He rushed to her side, pressing a worn, ragged towel and a bottle of cheap brandy into her hands. "You laid eyes on him? Did he recognize you?" "He saw a waitress. Nothing more," Sophia said, her voice raspy. She took a long swallow of the liquor, feeling its fiery trail burn down her throat. "But then he insulted the family, and he said it in the old dialect. I could not stop myself, Enzo. I spoke back to him." Enzo shut his eyes tight and let out a string of soft curses in Italian. "You replied to the devil using his own language. Now the entire pack of wolves will be on the hunt." "I need the package, Enzo," she demanded, her gaze locking onto his. "The one Papa left for me." For a long moment, Enzo just stood there. He looked down at the young woman he had shielded from the world's darkest shadows for 20 years. "This is a suicide mission, Sophia. If you open that steel box, you can never go back to being a simple waitress. You will become the Dawn once more. You will become the primary target." "I am already the target," she stated, forcing herself to her feet. The bone-deep weariness that had settled in her muscles seemed to melt away, replaced by an ice-cold, razor-sharp fury. "Give it to me." Enzo let out a long sigh, utterly defeated by the fire he saw in her eyes. It was the very same expression her father, Giovanni Valente, always had right before he gave the order for a hit. He moved behind the main counter and used a crowbar to pry up a floorboard that had always been loose. From the dark space beneath, he lifted out a heavy steel briefcase carefully wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the countertop with a heavy thud. Sophia slowly ran her fingers across the cold, unforgiving metal. Inside that case lay the access codes to the Valente family's offshore accounts, a comprehensive contact list of the secret agents her father had strategically placed across Europe, and the most critical item of all, the Libro Rosso, the infamous Red Book. That book held the proof of every single bribe, every murder, and every act of betrayal committed by the other 5 families over the last 30 years. It was the ultimate leverage, a weapon of total annihilation. "Take it," Enzo urged. "There is a boat waiting at the end of the pier. The Lucia. The key is hidden under the welcome mat. Get to Jersey. I will do my best to hold them off if they show up here. They are not coming for you, Enzo, she said, her voice now gentle. They have no idea that you are still alive. Crash! The skylight directly above them exploded into 1,000 pieces. Shards of glass rained down around them like a shower of deadly diamonds. Thick ropes dropped from the ceiling beams above. Before Enzo could even lift his shotgun, a flashbang grenade landed and detonated right in the middle of the room. The entire world dissolved into a blinding sheet of white light. A piercing, high-pitched scream tore through Sophia's ears. The force of the blast threw her backward into the stack of lobster traps, knocking the air completely out of her lungs. As the smoke swirled and the ringing in her head continued, she could see dark shadows descending from the ceiling. They were covered in tactical gear, wearing night vision goggles, and their weapons were fitted with suppressors. This was not the police, and it was certainly not the Moretti family's street thugs. This was an operation carried out with high-grade military precision. Enzo let out a furious roar, firing his shotgun blindly into the thick smoke. Boom! One of the shadows crumpled to the ground, but then 3 distinct red laser dots converged on the center of Enzo's chest. No! Sophia screamed, desperately scrambling for the briefcase. Thip, thip, thip. The sound was quiet, almost surgical. Enzo's body jerked backward as if hit by an invisible force, 3 small holes appearing on his shirt. He collapsed over the counter, gone from the world before his head even touched the wood. Sophia had no time to grieve. Pure, unadulterated instinct surged through her. She grabbed the handle of the steel briefcase and threw her body to the right, a split second before a spray of bullets tore up the floorboards right where she had been. She scrambled for cover behind a heavy industrial freezer near the back door. She had to get to the back door. She kicked the freezer's door open, using it as a temporary shield, and made a desperate bolt for the rear exit. Bullets sparked against the metal doorframe as she burst through it and onto the rotting, slick wood of the pier. The downpour had become a torrential flood. The wind howled like a hungry wolf. She sprinted toward the Lucia, the small fishing boat that was bucking violently in the choppy waves. "There is nowhere left to run, Principessa," a voice called out, somehow carrying over the storm. Sophia skidded to a stop. Blocking her path to the boat was Dante Moretti. He stood there all by himself. He held a handgun loosely at his side, the barrel pointed toward the ground. He was not wearing any tactical gear. He was completely soaked in his ruined, expensive suit, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. "You led them right to me," Sophia spat out, clutching the briefcase tightly to her chest as she took a step back toward the pier's edge. "I did not lead anyone," Dante shouted back, taking a cautious step forward. "I came here alone. Look at them, Sophia. Those men are not mine." Sophia risked a quick glance back toward the bait shop. The tactical team was now streaming out of the back door. They were raising their weapons, not only at her, but aiming directly at Dante, too. "Drop the weapon, Moretti," the lead commando yelled, his voice flat and emotionless. "Or our orders are to clean the entire slate." For just a fraction of a second, Dante looked utterly confused. "What? It is a coup, you absolute idiot!" Sophia screamed at him. "Duck!" She did not run. She did not dive into the churning water. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron. She was somehow still wearing the ridiculous Waitress apron. She pulled out the second flashbang, the one she had managed to grab from the floor of the bait shop when the first soldier had fallen. She pulled the pin with her teeth and threw it in a perfect arc over Dante's head, aiming it straight at the tactical team. Bang! Dante flinched instinctively, throwing an arm up to shield his eyes. When he lowered it and looked up again, the professional tactical team was in disarray, temporarily blinded and confused. "Move!" Sophia screamed. She grabbed Dante by the lapel of his very expensive suit and started dragging him toward the edge of the pier. "What in the hell are you doing?" Dante yelled, struggling against her grip. "I am saving your life, so that I can have the pleasure of killing you later." With that, she shoved him with all her strength, Dante stumbled backward off the pier, hitting the freezing, oily water of the Hudson River with a huge splash. Sophia held the briefcase tightly and leaped in right after him. Bullets ripped into the water's surface just above their heads, leaving behind trails of bubbles that looked like swarms of angry hornets. But the dark, powerful current of the Hudson quickly swallowed them both whole. The area underneath Pier 41 was a dark forest of rotting wooden pilings covered in sharp barnacles. The air was a toxic combination of raw sewage and gasoline. Dante Moretti broke the surface, gasping for air in the suffocating gloom under the pier. The water was so cold it felt like ice. He thrashed around, trying desperately to get a grip on a slimy crossbeam. "Be quiet," a voice hissed from the nearby darkness. He instantly went still. Sophia was there, clinging to a piling just 3 feet away from him. The steel briefcase was now strapped securely to her wrist with her own belt. She was shivering uncontrollably, her thin waitress uniform stuck to her skin, but her eyes were sharp and focused on the narrow gaps in the floorboards directly above their heads. Heavy combat boots stomped around overhead. Bright flashlight beams cut through the cracks in the wood, slicing into the darkness where they hid. "Clear," a voice echoed from above them. "They must have gone under. The current has probably already taken them out. Deploy the thermal drone." "Thermal," Dante whispered, a new wave of panic rising in his chest. "We have to move right now." "Shut up," Sophia snapped, her voice low and sharp. "Follow my lead. Stay as low as you can. If you make a splash, I am leaving you behind." She pushed away from the piling, moving through the water with a silent, frog-like stroke, heading deeper into the maze of the underpier. Dante followed her, his muscles already starting to seize up from the intense cold. He was a trained boxer, a skilled shooter, a man who spent 2 hours every day in the gym, but he was finding it difficult to keep up with the slender young woman who had been serving him wine just a couple of hours ago. She skillfully led him to a rusted maintenance ladder that was covered in thick green algae. They climbed up and into a storm drain tunnel that ran beneath the West Side Highway. It was mostly dry inside, and it smelled of damp earth and rats. They both collapsed onto a concrete ledge, gasping for air. Dante rolled onto his back, staring up at the curved ceiling of the tunnel. Those men, they were outfitted in Russian gear, but they spoke English with perfect American accents. "Mercenaries," Sophia said, wringing the filthy water out of her hair. She quickly checked the briefcase. The seal was still tight. High-end private contractors. "Who hired them?" Dante asked, pushing himself into a sitting position. "My father," Sophia said, followed by a harsh, empty laugh. "Your father would want the satisfaction of killing me himself. He would never send a faceless hit squad to blow up a bait shop. He is from the old school. He would need to look me in the eye." She turned her head to face him directly. The dim light filtering down from a street grate above cast long, dark shadows across her determined face. "And they also tried to kill you, Dante. You saw those lasers. If I had not thrown that flashbang, your brains would be decorating the dock right now." Dante fell silent. He knew she was right. The order had been to clean the slate. "Someone wants to start a war," Dante said, the gears slowly turning in his exhausted mind. "If I die, and the last Valente also dies, who stands to gain from that?" "Chaos always benefits the hungry," Sophia replied, quoting another one of her father's proverbs. She shivered again, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. "The Russos are far too stupid to plan something with this much precision. The Costellos are too broke to afford it. It has to be someone on the inside," Dante realized, and the thought tasted like poison in his mouth. "Someone who knew exactly where I was going tonight. Only 3 people knew I was tracking you to Red Hook. Your father," Sophia listed immediately. "No, he would not try to kill me. Your head of security, Thorne." Dante shook his head again. "Thorne took a bullet for me last year. The man is loyal. Loyalty always has an expiration date when the paycheck is large enough," Sophia countered, her tone cynical. "Who else knew?" Dante hesitated for a moment. "Rocco," My family's consigliere. Sophia's eyes narrowed into slits. Rocco, the same man who sat at your table tonight. The one who laughed when your father referred to me as a sheep. He has been with your family since before I was even born, Dante said, his voice defensive. Which means he clearly remembers the old days, Sophia pointed out. He remembers a time when the Morettis were absolute kings, not the corporate chief executive officers you pretend to be. Maybe he believes you have gone soft, Dante. Maybe he thinks your father has gotten too old to rule. Maybe he wants the crown for himself. Dante pushed himself to his feet and began pacing anxiously in the confined tunnel. I need a phone. I have to call this in. If you call anyone, you will die, Sophia said, her voice remaining perfectly calm. They can easily track your voice print. They can triangulate your signal in seconds. If Rocco is truly behind this, he now has access to the National Security Agency level technology your family purchased last year. Dante stopped pacing and just stared at her. He really looked at her, there in the dim light with dirt smudged on her face and a stolen steel briefcase resting in her lap. She was not the shy waitress from the restaurant. She was a general planning a war. You seem to know an awful lot about our operations for a girl who just busses tables, Dante said, a clear note of admiration in his voice. That was laced with something colder than steel. Sophia's voice was steady. For 3 long years I have studied you. I know the restaurants you prefer, the people who share your bed, and the secret places where you stash your money. That was the Valente way, Dante. We never settled for just breaking knees. We armed ourselves with information, because knowledge is the one weapon that never, ever runs out of ammunition. So why are we still alive? Dante had to ask. You served my father his wine tonight. A little cyanide in the bottle would have been simple. You could have driven a steak knife through my chest. Why draw this out? For a brief second, Sophia glanced at the briefcase, and her expression softened, showing the ghost of the 12-year-old girl who saw her world burn to the ground. She whispered, "Because death is a gift. Your father murdered my mother. He took my brothers from me. He turned my home into ashes. If I had simply put a bullet in his skull, he would die a legend. The world would remember the great Don Salvatore." She lifted her head, and her eyes were 2 burning coals. I refuse to let him die a legend. I want him to die as a complete and utter failure. I want him to be forced to watch his entire empire turn to dust around him, piece by agonizing piece. And I need him to know that a Valente was the one who took everything from him, not with a firearm, but with the unvarnished truth. She rested a hand on the briefcase. This case holds the truth, Dante. It's the Libro Rosso. Inside is all the proof of the quiet agreements between the 5 families and the senators, the judges, and the union bosses who protect them. The moment I release this information, the FBI does not just come for you. They will dismantle the entire corrupt system you call a business. The Moretti family name will be nothing but a bad memory. Dante could only stare at the case. That book is just a story. It is a myth. My father told me it burned to ashes with the rest of your house. My father managed to throw it out of a window to Enzo just before the entire roof collapsed. Sophia corrected him. Dante dragged a hand through his thick hair. He was completely cornered. He was standing in a filthy sewer with a woman who possessed the power to shatter his world into a million pieces, and just outside, a traitor was hunting for both their heads. Dante's voice was barely a whisper. So what is the next move? You leak the contents of that book, I end up in a federal prison, and you finally have your revenge. I cannot release it just yet, Sophia admitted, her voice tight with frustration. The files are protected by a complex encryption. The key is not simple, and if I come out of hiding to try and decrypt it, Rocco's personal death squad will find me. Now that they know you are alive, they will eventually find you too. She pushed herself to her feet, hissing in pain as she put pressure on her injured left leg. This presents a problem for us, Dante. We are supposed to be mortal enemies. By every law of our world, I should kill you where you stand and take my chances alone. and you should be trying to choke the life out of me to take that book. But, Dante cut in, taking a cautious step toward her, if we do that, then Rocco gets everything he wants. He will seize the throne, he will bury my father, and he will hunt each of us down until we are both dead. Exactly. With a deep breath, Dante extended his hand. The gesture was an act of pure insanity. He was a Moretti offering a handshake to a Valente. It was an act that defied 100 years of bloodshed and hatred. A temporary truce, Dante proposed. Until we can make it through the night, until we can confirm that it really is Rocco behind all this. I will help you get to a secure location. In return, you do not release the book. Sophia stared at his outstretched hand. She saw the old scars across his knuckles. Then she looked into his eyes. They were the eyes of a man raised by a monster, yet they held a surprising amount of kindness. She refused to take his hand. I do not shake hands with Morettis, she stated, her tone like ice. But for tonight, I will not kill you. You should lead the way, boss. You know this city far better than I ever will. Dante let his hand fall to his side, and a small smirk played on his lips. You are a truly terrifying woman, do you know that? I am just a simple waitress, she said with a perfectly straight face. Right. And I am just a consultant in the waste management industry. Dante gestured down the dark tunnel. There is an emergency exit that leads up near Chelsea. I have a safe house there, one that is completely off the books. Not even my own father knows it exists. It is an artist's loft. I use it for my private time. You mean you use it for your mistresses? Sophia shot back, limping ahead of him. I mean I use it for my painting, Dante corrected her. Sophia actually stopped and looked back at him, her expression one of genuine shock. You paint? Everybody needs to have a hobby, Dante grumbled, pushing past her into the darkness. Let's go, before the rats in here get any braver. They navigated the gloom together, the two surviving heirs of a shattered kingdom, moving toward a new day that held no promise except more violence. But as they walked, the very air between them began to change. They were no longer the hunter and the hunted. They had become partners. And in the criminal underworld, a partnership, forged from sheer necessity, is often more powerful than a marriage made from love. But neither of them saw the tiny red light blinking softly on the briefcase's handle. It was not a bomb. It was a sophisticated tracker. Far away, inside a penthouse with a view of Central Park, Rocco smiled. He watched the small blip as it moved slowly beneath 10th Avenue. I have you, Rocco whispered, swirling the expensive cognac in his glass. Kill the father, then kill the son, and bring the girl to me. The Valente witch is carrying something that belongs to my family. The safe house was not what Sophia had imagined at all. She was expecting a concrete bunker, some windowless room with racks of guns on the walls and dirty mattresses tossed on the floor. Instead, Dante guided her into a massive, high-ceilinged loft in the heart of Chelsea. The air smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, not of gunpowder and fear. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with canvases. They were huge, chaotic, and breathtakingly beautiful paintings. She saw violent explosions of red and black, silent screaming faces, and hands desperately reaching for a help that was never going to come. You actually do paint, Sophia whispered in awe, letting the heavy briefcase drop onto a perfect white sofa. She walked over to a large canvas still on its easel. It was an unfinished piece, a portrait of a woman with profoundly sad eyes. It helps keep the ghosts quiet, Dante explained, as he locked the heavy steel door behind them, activating a keypad that engaged multiple deadbolts. He moved to a small kitchenette and retrieved a first aid kit. Sit down. Let me take a look at that leg. Sophia paused for a moment. Then she sat on the arm of the sofa. The adrenaline from their escape was gone, and in its place was a deep, throbbing pain in her calf, where a piece of metal had torn her skin at the pier. Dante knelt down in front of her. He carefully cut away the ruined fabric of her waitress uniform with a pair of small medical shears. For a man with such dangerous hands, his touch was incredibly gentle. "It is just a shallow cut," he said, gently dabbing the wound with antiseptic. "It is clean. You will not require stitches." "You have very good hands," Sophia murmured, her eyes fixed on his face. "For a Moretti." Dante stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. Their faces were only inches from each other. The feeling in the room changed instantly. The tension was no longer about survival. It was something else entirely, something magnetic. "And you have far too many secrets," Dante replied in a low voice, "for a Valente." He finished applying the bandage to her leg, but he did not move away. "Why did you really save me, Sophia? You could have easily let those mercenaries kill me. That would be one less Moretti for you to worry about." Sophia's gaze drifted back to the painting of the sad woman. "Because I was watching you tonight, in the restaurant right after your father insulted me. I saw you flinch. You despised what he did. You are not like him, Dante." "I am exactly like him," Dante said with a bitter edge, getting to his feet and walking to the window to peek through the blinds. "I manage his entire business. I clean up every single one of his messes. I am the heir to his bloody throne." "You are a prisoner," Sophia corrected him from the sofa, "the same way I was. We are both just children who have spent our lives cleaning up the blood our fathers spilled." Dante turned from the window to face her, a look of pure vulnerability on his features. For just a second, the powerful Mafia prince vanished completely. He walked back toward her, pulled by an invisible force he could not begin to understand. He reached out a hand, and his fingertips gently grazed her cheek. Sophia did not pull back. Instead, she leaned into his touch, and her eyes slowly closed. "If we manage to get out of this alive," Dante whispered, "I am finished. I am walking away from this life. I will take enough money, and I will disappear." "There is no walking away," Sophia said, her voice filled with sadness. "Not as long as Rocco is out there hunting us, and not as long as that book still exists." She looked down toward the briefcase. A sudden, chilling realization hit her like a wave of ice water. "Dante," she said, her voice suddenly sharp and loud. "The handle." "What are you talking about?" "The handle on the briefcase. It feels warm." Dante's eyes went wide with understanding. He lunged for the case, flipping it upside down. There, embedded in the black steel near the hinge, was a tiny, pulsing red light, no larger than the head of a pin. "It is a tracker," Dante hissed. "A high-frequency model. How long has it been on?" Sophia was already on her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her leg. Dante glanced at his watch. "If he has been tracking us since we were at Red Hook, he is not coming here by himself. He is bringing his entire army." Crack! The massive skylight above them exploded into 1,000 pieces. It was happening just like it did for Enzo. History was repeating itself. Thick ropes dropped from the ceiling. But this time, Dante was prepared. He grabbed Sophia by the arm and tackled her behind a heavy oak drafting table, just as the entire loft filled with choking tear gas. "Masks are under the sink!" Dante shouted, firing his handgun blindly over the top of the table. The main door to the loft was blown inward with a deafening explosion. Through the swirling gray smoke, several figures started to emerge. But this time, they were not just hired mercenaries. The man leading them wore a gas mask that made him look like a horrifying mechanical insect. It was Rocco, and he was dragging someone along with him. Dante squinted, his eyes stinging from the gas. "Papa!" Don Salvatore Moretti was thrown hard onto the floor in the middle of the room. His hands were not tied, but he was completely disoriented, coughing and gasping for air. Rocco ripped off his own mask, a wide smile spreading across his face like a shark sensing blood. The loft's powerful ventilation system was already clearing the gas from the air. "Come on out, Dante," Rocco's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. "Come out and let me introduce your new girlfriend to your father the right way." Dante looked over at Sophia. "He is using him as a human shield." "No," Sophia whispered, her mind working furiously. This is much worse. He is setting up a stage. He wants Salvatore to see the two of us together. He is going to frame you for all of this. We have to finish this now, Dante said. He quickly checked his magazine. I only have 6 rounds left. There are at least 10 of his men in here. I have the book, Sophia stated calmly. And I am the only one who knows the code. She began to stand up. Sophia, don't. Dante reached for her, but she was already stepping away. She walked out from behind the safety of the table with her hands raised high in the air, the steel briefcase held firmly in her left hand. Hold your fire! Rocco screamed at his men. He was grinning from ear to ear. Well, look what we have here. The little waitress has returned to us. Don Salvatore managed to push himself up onto his hands and knees. He looked weak and confused. He looked up and his eyes locked onto Sophia. Then he saw his son Dante emerge right behind her, his gun still raised. Dante! Salvatore gasped out. You are with her? You are with the Valente girl? He told you that I kidnapped her? Is that right, Don Salvatore? Sophia asked. Her voice was surprisingly calm and clear, echoed across the vast, empty space. She advanced cautiously until only 10 feet separated her from Rocco. Salvatore began to speak, his voice raw with renewed fury. He fed me a story. He told me that my own son was a traitor. He claimed Enzo was leaking our most guarded information to the Valentes and that he was plotting to murder me and seize control. How could you believe that? Dante's voice thundered, his firearm aimed squarely at Rocco's head. Father, just look at the man. He was the one who hired the Russian mercenaries. He was the one who tried to have me killed down at the pier. Those are nothing but lies, Rocco replied, his tone chillingly calm as he pressed the cold steel barrel of his gun harder against Salvatore's temple. Let go of your weapon, Dante, or I promise this old lion will not see another sunrise. The entire room went still, caught in a deadly standoff. It was an impossible situation. If Dante fired at Rocco, he would certainly sentence his father to death. Rocco had absolute control. Sophia then broke the silence, lifting the briefcase slightly. Is this the book you are looking for, Rocco? This is the prize you really came for, is it not? Hand it over to me right now, Rocco commanded, his eyes fixed on the case. If you do, I might consider letting the boy walk away from here. As for the old man, his time was running out one way or another. You have no interest in the political leverage against the senators, Sophia countered, her voice gaining strength and conviction. The real reason you want this book is because of what is written on page 42. For a brief second, Rocco's eyes widened, a tiny fleeting sign of pure panic. What secrets are on page 42? Salvatore asked, his gaze shifting between them. It is the complete record of all the skimming operations from 1995 to 2005, Sophia declared, inventing the detail with confidence. While she did not know the exact page, she knew the nature of the crime from Enzo's meticulously kept notes. He was never just your loyal servant, Don Salvatore. He was actively stealing from you for years, a full 10% from every single shipment. He managed to build his entire criminal enterprise using the scraps from your table. She is a liar, Rocco shrieked, his grip on the trigger becoming dangerously tight. Kill them! I want you to kill them both right now. Wait, Sophia yelled over his command. Let me open it. I will show you the proof. She carefully placed the briefcase on the concrete floor. She lowered herself to her knees and began to turn the combination dials. 12, 25, 98. The very day her home was burned to the ground. It was her father's dark, twisted sense of humor. The latches made a clicking sound. They sprang open. Rocco took a decisive step forward, his overwhelming greed making him reckless. He shoved Salvatore roughly to the side and pointed his weapon directly at Sophia. Show it to me, now! With a steady hand, Sophia lifted the lid of the case. Inside, there was nothing. It was completely empty. Rocco could only stare in disbelief. Where is it? he demanded, his voice cracking. Where did you hide the book? Sophia looked up at him, a truly terrifying smile spreading across her face. I destroyed it in a fire 3 years ago, Rocco. The real power was never in the book itself. She then slowly tapped her own temple with her finger. All of it is right here. Rocco's face contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained rage. You, he seethed, raising his pistol to finally silence her. A loud bang echoed, but the gunshot had not come from Dante. Rocco's body went rigid, an expression of complete and utter shock washed over his features. He glanced down at his chest, where a dark red stain was beginning to bloom like a grotesque flower, blossoming on his shirt. He turned his body with great effort. Don Salvatore Moretti stood just a few feet away, holding a small .22 caliber pistol that he had expertly retrieved from a holster strapped to his ankle. It was the one place Rocco had failed to search. You took from me, Rocco, Salvatore whispered, his voice trembling with an old, deep rage. You dared to steal from this family? Rocco tried to speak, but only blood gurgled in his throat as he collapsed onto his knees. I am the one who made you, Salvatore said with contempt. Without me, you are absolutely nothing. He raised the gun and fired a second time. Another bang filled the room. Rocco's body slammed against the hard floor. The hired mercenaries, seeing that their employer was now dead, exchanged uncertain glances. They were professionals, after all. No payment meant there was no reason to continue the fight. Get out! Dante roared, gesturing aggressively toward the exit with his gun. Leave now before I bring the entire New York Police Department down on this place. The mercenaries required no further convincing. They scrambled through the shattered doorway and melted away into the darkness of the city night. An even heavier silence descended upon the loft. Don Salvatore stood over Rocco's lifeless body, his breathing heavy and labored. The small pistol fell from his hand, and he leaned his tired body against a nearby pillar for support. Dante secured his own weapon and quickly moved to his father's side, catching him just as his legs gave out. Father, Dante said, his fingers immediately searching for the old man's pulse. Are you all right? I am old, Salvatore grumbled, weakly pushing Dante's hands away. But I am not dead. He took a moment to straighten his coat, then his eyes found Sophia, who was still kneeling beside the empty briefcase. Salvatore used his cane, which Rocco had tossed aside, to tap against the metal case. You were not telling the truth, he said, his voice a low rasp. You lied about the book. It was a bluff, Sophia corrected him, as she gracefully rose to her feet. Every Valente knows how to play a good hand of poker. Salvatore simply stared at her, studying her face intensely. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the eerie whistle of the wind coming through the shattered skylight above. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, and in her features he saw the unmistakable ghost of Giovanni Valente. You have your father's eyes, Salvatore observed with a quiet finality. And you certainly have his relentless stubbornness. And you now have a debt to pay, Sophia replied, her voice unwavering. I was the one who saved your son. I protected your entire empire from a traitor in your midst, and I chose to spare your life in that sewer when I could have easily left you there to die. Salvatore gave a slow, deliberate nod. What you say is true. The ancient code is clear on this. A life must be given for a life. He reached deep into his coat pocket and withdrew a heavy, ornate gold ring, the Moretti family signet. He glanced at Dante, and then his gaze settled on Sophia. I am weary, Dante, Salvatore admitted with a heavy sigh. Tonight has shown me that I can no longer trust the men that I have raised. Then his eyes returned to Sophia. Except for you. This feud between our families is over. It ends tonight. The Valente family is gone. You are now Sophia Rossi, and you are a waitress. Is that understood? Sophia paused for a moment. Her eyes met Dante's, and she could see the profound hope reflected there. Yes, she finally answered, her voice soft. I am just a waitress. Good, Salvatore replied with a firm nod. My son needs a good woman by his side, not another soldier. But if I ever hear you speak that old dialect in public again—" He narrowed his eyes, but then the corner of his mouth twitched upwards into a slight smile. "I will have no choice but to fire you." Dante let out a laugh, a sound filled with pure, unadulterated relief. He wrapped a protective arm around Sophia's waist, pulling her tightly against him. "Let us take you home, father," Dante said gently. The grand reopening of Il Gioiello was the most talked-about event of the entire social season. The media was present, with cameras flashing, capturing photos of powerful politicians and famous celebrities. However, the true center of power was located at Table 1 on the mezzanine level. Dante Moretti was seated at the head of that table. He was not dressed in a business suit. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, though his tie was comfortably loosened. He appeared at ease and genuinely happier than he had in years. Don Salvatore sat at his right hand, looking fragile but deeply content as he slowly sipped his expensive Barolo. "The quality of the service here has certainly improved," Salvatore remarked, his eyes scanning the busy floor below. "I hired a new manager," Dante replied with a broad grin. Just then, Sophia approached their table. She was not in a waitress uniform. Instead, she wore a breathtaking backless red gown that likely cost more than the old car she once drove. She was not carrying a serving tray. She moved with the grace and confidence of a queen. "Gentlemen," she said, placing a delicate hand on Dante's shoulder. "Is everything to your complete satisfaction?" "It is perfect, my love," Dante responded, gently kissing her hand. Salvatore looked up at her, a critical expression on his face. "The wine is excellent, but this bread is cold." Sophia did not even blink. She leaned down so that her lips were right beside the old Don's ear and whispered in a flawless, thick Sicilian dialect, "You will eat the bread you are given, old wolf, or I will have the cook put you on a permanent diet." For a moment, Salvatore was completely frozen. Then he leaned his head back and let out a huge, booming laugh. It was a loud and joyous sound that caused the entire restaurant to fall silent and turn to look in their direction. "She is absolutely terrifying," Salvatore said to his son, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. "You must keep her." Sophia simply smiled, gave Dante's hand a gentle squeeze, and then turned to walk away and greet her other distinguished guests. She was no longer a person who went unnoticed. She was Sophia Moretti, the woman who had successfully tamed the lions of New York. And as she glided through the crowded room, not a single person dared to look away from her. And that is the story of how a shy waitress, who once trembled while pouring a simple glass of water, rose to become the undisputed queen of New York City. She did not need a weapon to win her war. She used her intelligence, her heritage, and the one weapon the Mafia was never prepared for: the unvarnished truth. Sophia demonstrated that in a world full of wolves, the most formidable creature is not always the one with the sharpest teeth. It is often the one who knows the precise moment to strike. Sophia's story teaches us something powerful. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The person pouring your water, the server you never look at twice, the nobody in the corner. They see everything, they hear everything, and when the moment comes, they can change the entire game. This story also reminds us that revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing to rise above the past and build something new. Sophia could have killed Don Salvatore. Instead, she chose to become the queen of his empire. For those of you who have ever been dismissed, overlooked, or called nothing, remember this: your invisibility is your armor, your silence is your strategy, and your moment is coming. So, I have to ask you, what is your opinion? Did Sophia make the correct decision when she saved the very man who was responsible for destroying her family? Or do you believe she should have pursued her own form of revenge? I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of deceit, passion, and Sicilian-style justice, please smash that like button, make sure you hit subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you will never miss one of our stories. We have an incredible new thriller coming out next week that you will not believe. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay dangerous. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Every story we share is designed to touch your heart and remind you of your own strength. Thank you for being part of our community